tonight, you're about to step into a world where shadows meant something, where a flickering candle wasn't just a flame, and where a sudden chill could mean you were no longer alone. In the Middle Ages, people didn't think the world was random. Every sound in the night, every echo in an empty hall, every whisper of wind through a wooden door carried a message. They believed bread could predict the future, that stars shaped your destiny, and that even your shadow might hold secrets about your soul. But here's the fascinating part. These beliefs didn't sound foolish back then. They sounded logical, convincing, even undeniable. So what made millions of people trust ideas that today seem completely impossible? And if they were so certain, could some of our obvious truths today be just as fragile? As you listen, let your mind slow down. Imagine candlelight flickering on stone walls, distant church bells echoing through cold air, footsteps in quiet corridors where every creak felt like a sign, "Stay with me." Because once you see how medieval minds made sense of their world, you may start questioning your own. And by the end of this journey, you might realize something unexpected. The past wasn't as irrational as it seems, and we may not be as different as we think. In the medieval world, truth was not something tested in laboratories or verified through controlled experiments. It was something inherited, repeated, and trusted because respected authorities had written it down centuries earlier. People relied on ancient scholars, religious interpretations, folklore, and word of mouth to understand the universe around them. As a result, many beliefs sounded completely logical within their worldview, even though today we know they were entirely false. One of the most widespread ideas was that the Earth stood unmoving at the center of the universe, while the sun, moon, and stars revolved around it in perfect spheres. This geocentric model, strongly associated with the works of ancient thinkers like Ptolemy, seemed obvious because people could see the sun rise and set each day. It felt natural to assume the heavens moved around humanity, rather than the other way around. The stars appeared fixed. The ground felt stable beneath one's feet, and without telescopes or advanced mathematics, there was no easy way to detect the Earth's motion. The idea persisted for centuries and shaped theology, philosophy, and science, until later astronomers challenged it. Another belief that sounded convincing was that disease was caused by bad air, or miasma. During outbreaks like the devastating plague that swept across Europe in the 14th century, people believed foul smells carried illness. When the Black Death spread rapidly, killing millions, communities burned herbs, carried flowers, and wore masks stuffed with fragrant materials in an attempt to purify the air. The logic seemed sound. Sickness often followed foul odors in crowded cities with poor sanitation. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, invisible pathogens were unimaginable. It would take centuries before the germ theory of disease replaced miasma theory. But in the medieval mindset, protecting oneself from bad smells felt like protecting oneself from death. Equally persuasive was the doctrine of the four humours, inherited from ancient medical theory and attributed largely to Hippocrates, and later expanded by Galen. According to this system, the human body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and health depended on their balance. If someone became ill, it meant one humour dominated the others. Treatments like bloodletting, purging, or induced vomiting were used to restore balance. These practices often weakened patients rather than cured them, yet they seemed logical because they provided a structured explanation for symptoms. If a person had a fever and a flushed face, it was interpreted as an excess of blood. Removing blood appeared to relieve pressure and restore harmony. The theory was elegant, systematic, and deeply embedded in education, making it difficult to question. Medieval bestiaries also presented creatures that people believed were real. Travelers' tales and illustrated manuscripts described unicorns, basilisks, and dragons as genuine animals inhabiting distant lands. The basilisk, for example, was said to kill with a single glance. These stories blended religious symbolism with natural history, and without global communication or scientific classification, strange animals reported by merchants or explorers were rarely doubted. Exotic creatures from Africa or Asia could easily be exaggerated into monsters. Since few people travelled far from home, second-hand descriptions became accepted truth. Another false, yet persuasive belief was that women were inherently colder and wetter than men in temperament, based on the humoral system. This supposed biological difference was used to justify social hierarchies and restrictions. Scholars argued that men were naturally rational and balanced, while women were more emotional because of their humoral composition. The reasoning fit neatly within the broader worldview of cosmic balance and order, reinforcing cultural norms with what appeared to be scientific backing. Astrology also played a powerful role. Many medieval Europeans believed the positions of the planets determined personality, fate, and even the outcome of political events. Physicians consulted star charts before performing treatments, and rulers sought astrologers' advice before making decisions. Since celestial bodies followed predictable patterns, it seemed reasonable that their movements influenced earthly affairs. If the moon could affect tides, perhaps it could also affect human bodies, which were thought to contain water governed by similar forces. The connection felt intuitive and harmonized with the idea of a universe filled with symbolic correspondences. A particularly striking belief was that spontaneous generation explained the origin of life. It was widely accepted that maggots emerged from rotting meat, or that mice could arise from piles of grain and rags. Without microscopes to reveal eggs or larvae, these transformations appeared to occur out of nowhere. Observations supported the illusion. Leave meat uncovered, and worms appeared, store grain poorly, and rodents emerged. The simplest explanation seemed to be that life formed directly from non-living matter. This concept aligned with broader ideas about the natural world being infused with vital forces. Medieval maps reflected another misconception, that certain parts of the world were populated by monstrous races with dog heads or single giant feet used as umbrellas. Cartographers filled unknown regions with imaginative beings, partly to represent danger and mystery. The unfamiliar was often interpreted through myth, rather than investigation. The world beyond Europe was largely uncharted in the medieval imagination, and uncertainty was easier to fill with legend than with admitted ignorance. People also believed that touching certain objects could cure illness through divine or magical power. Relics of saints were thought to heal the sick, and some monarchs claimed the ability to cure diseases like scrofula through royal touch. The faith in sacred power was reinforced by occasional recoveries that were likely coincidental. When someone improved after visiting a shrine, it confirmed belief rather than raising doubts. Another widespread misconception was that bathing too frequently could weaken the body by opening pores and allowing disease to enter. In some periods, public baths fell out of favor partly because of fears about vulnerability to illness. Since people noticed that epidemics spread in crowded bathhouses, they associated bathing with sickness rather than hygiene with health. The correlation seemed to confirm the fear, even though the true causes were unrelated to clean water itself. Medieval thinkers also believed that comets were omens of disaster. When a bright comet appeared in the sky, it was often interpreted as a warning of war, famine, or the death of a ruler. The sudden and dramatic appearance of such celestial phenomena felt too significant to be random, since major events frequently occurred within a short time after a comet's appearance. Confirmation bias strengthened the association. Without an understanding of orbital mechanics, comets were mysterious visitors whose unpredictability invited supernatural explanation. The belief in alchemy further illustrates how convincing false ideas could be. Alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold and discover an elixir of life. The idea was rooted in the assumption that all matter shared fundamental properties and could be perfected. Observations of metals changing color when heated supported the notion of transformation. Although modern chemistry shows that turning lead into gold requires nuclear reactions rather than chemical ones, the medieval framework made the pursuit seem plausible and even philosophically profound. In legal systems, trial by ordeal was practiced under the assumption that divine intervention would reveal innocence. An accused person might be required to hold a hot iron or be submerged in water. If they healed quickly or floated in a certain way, it was taken as proof of God's judgment. The belief rested on unwavering faith that a higher power would not allow injustice. From within that worldview, the method seemed fair and spiritually guided. Even everyday animals were misunderstood. It was believed that beavers would bite off their own testicles to escape hunters seeking medicinal glands. This story, repeated in manuscripts, reinforced moral lessons about sacrifice and purity. Since few people observed beavers directly, the myth went largely unchallenged. The medieval period was not defined by ignorance, but by limited tools for verification. Many beliefs that now seem absurd were logical conclusions drawn from available evidence and inherited authority. The absence of microscopes, telescopes, and experimental methods meant that explanations relied on analogy, tradition, and symbolism. When patterns appeared to confirm a theory, it gained strength through repetition. Over time, as new instruments and methods emerged during the Renaissance and scientific revolution, these long-held ideas were re-evaluated and replaced. Yet for centuries, they shaped societies, guided medical treatments, influenced politics, and framed how people understood their place in the cosmos. What makes these beliefs fascinating is not simply that they were wrong, but that they once felt undeniably true. Beyond medicine, astronomy, and monsters, medieval Europe was filled with deeply rooted assumptions that felt reasonable within the framework of the time, but were ultimately mistaken. One powerful belief was that the Earth's climate zones determined the intelligence and moral character of the people who lived there. Drawing from ancient geographic theories, scholars argued that those who lived in very hot regions were impulsive and emotional, while those in cold regions were dull but strong. Medieval belief systems continue to expand into the rhythm of everyday repetition, turning habit into omen and interruption into revelation. Many people believed that if a person repeatedly misplaced the same object, a ring, a knife, a small pouch, it meant unseen forces were testing their awareness. Human forgetfulness, entirely natural, was externalized into deliberate interference. When the object was found again in a surprising place, it confirmed the narrative that something had moved it. There was also the belief that if a gust of wind lifted ashes from a hearth and scattered them briefly before settling, it meant that messages from the past were resurfacing. The hearth was the center of domestic life, and its remnants symbolized memory. The unpredictable motion of ash felt like intentional stirring. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if two candles placed side by side leaned toward each other while burning, it signified harmony between two individuals in the household. Slight differences in melting angle were read as emotional alignment. Another mistaken belief held that if a person's footsteps made different sounds on the same path at different times, it reflected shifting fortune. Variations in moisture, footwear, or ground condition were less meaningful than destiny adjusting itself. Some believed that if a dog refused food without obvious illness, it sensed spiritual imbalance nearby. Animal instinct became moral barometer. There was also the idea that if someone frequently heard their name in the murmur of distant crowd noise, fate was preparing them for attention. The human brain's tendency to recognize familiar patterns in sound was interpreted as deliberate call. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that if dew formed thicker on one side of a field, that direction held stronger unseen influence. Microclimates were unknown, so asymmetry demanded explanation. Another misconception involved the assumption that if a flame burned quietly without crackling, it meant peace prevailed in the household. The moisture content of wood was overlooked in favor of symbolic tranquility. Some believed that if a person felt sudden laughter bubble up during serious work, it meant invisible beings were reminding them not to grow too proud. Emotional spontaneity was moral correction. There was also the conviction that if someone repeatedly encountered the same phrase or proverb in different contexts, it was destiny reinforcing a lesson. The natural repetition of popular sayings felt intentional. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a single leaf fell from a tree on a windless day, it meant change was imminent. Natural decay and gravity were overshadowed by symbolism. Another mistaken belief suggested that if someone's cloak brushed against a doorway and snagged slightly, it meant the house was reluctant to let them leave. Fabric friction became farewell gesture. Some thought that if a bird tapped lightly on a window, it was delivering warning rather than simply reacting to reflection. There was also the idea that if the moonlight cast unusually bright reflections on water, it indicated heightened spiritual energy in the region. Atmospheric clarity and angle were interpreted mystically. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a pot simmered steadily without boiling over for a long time, it symbolized patience rewarded. Heat control became metaphor turned omen. Another misconception involved the belief that if a person dreamed of walking through fog repeatedly, they were spiritually navigating uncertainty sent from beyond. Dreams, naturally shaped by stress or memory, became guidance. Some believed that if wind shifted direction suddenly during conversation, It meant the subject had attracted attention from unseen listeners. Meteorological variability became reaction. There was also the conviction that if two people accidentally mirrored each other's posture, it signified hidden alignment of purpose. Body language synchrony felt destined. Medieval thinking often treated repetition of minor events as reinforcement of narrative. Once a belief took root, confirmation bias ensured it flourished. Another mistaken belief held that if a flame briefly dimmed when someone entered a room, it reacted to their inner state. Oxygen displacement or airflow was ignored in favor of symbolism. Some thought that if frost traced delicate lines across a window resembling letters, it was attempting communication. The human tendency to see familiar shapes in randomness, pareidolia, became prophecy. There was also the idea that if someone frequently paused at the same spot along a path without conscious reason, it meant that ground held significance for their future. Subtle terrain changes were spiritualized. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a child stared intently at empty space, they perceived realities adults could not see. The imaginative absorption of children became supernatural awareness. Another misconception suggested that if a candle left behind an unusually long trail of hardened wax, it marked extended influence from the evening's events. Some believed that if a door latch clicked softly in the night without being touched, it meant movement between realms was occurring. Temperature contraction of metal became portal sound. There was also the conviction that if rain began exactly as a traveller stepped onto a road, it meant the journey was marked by unseen oversight. Coincidence became sign. Medieval belief framed the world as participatory. The wind did not simply blow, it responded. Fire did not merely burn, it signaled. Water did not simply flow, it carried memory. Another mistaken belief held that if someone heard faint music while alone in fields, it was the echo of ancient events lingering in the air. Natural acoustics or imagination were interpreted as residue of time. Some thought that if a person frequently crossed paths with the same stranger without speaking, it meant unfinished destiny hovered between them. There was also the idea that if a flame split into 3 distinct tongues momentarily, it represented the presence of layered realities intersecting. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if their reflection appeared unusually serious while they felt cheerful, it meant part of their spirit remained cautious. Lighting differences shaped perception. Another misconception involved the belief that if a breeze lifted dust into small spirals along a road, it meant invisible travelers were moving ahead. All these beliefs, countless and interconnected, formed a dense web of meaning. The medieval world was not empty of explanation. It was overflowing with it. Every motion had message, every pause had purpose. From our perspective, these ideas seem imaginative, even poetic. But they once shaped decisions, influenced emotions, and guided behavior. They offered comfort in unpredictability and structure in chaos. Without modern tools for verification, medieval society relied on observation filtered through story. Once stories repeated often enough, they hardened into truth. And yet, the instinct behind them is deeply human. Faced with uncertainty, we interpret. Faced with randomness, we search for pattern. Faced with silence, we imagine message. The medieval world reminds us that belief often feels strongest when evidence is weakest. Certainty can grow from repetition, authority, and shared narrative rather than proof. Centuries later, knowledge has shifted. Science has replaced many symbolic explanations, but the human impulse to connect events into meaning remains unchanged. What once sounded unquestionably true now feels fantastical, and someday, perhaps, some of our own unquestioned assumptions will seem just as fascinatingly mistaken, revealing not ignorance, but the ongoing evolution of understanding. Medieval belief continued to attach significance to the faintest shifts in ordinary life, building entire explanations from small sensations and repeating coincidences. Many people believed that if a person's candle guttered and produced a long trail of smoke after being blown out, it meant words spoken in that room would linger longer than intended. The visible persistence of smoke became metaphor turned mechanism, as if speech itself had physical weight that clung to the air. There was also the belief that if someone frequently felt compelled to glance over their shoulder while walking alone, it meant unseen forces were measuring their awareness. The natural instinct for environmental scanning, especially in dark or unfamiliar places, was interpreted as spiritual proximity rather than survival reflex. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a wooden beam in a house cracked sharply during winter, it signaled shifting fortune for the family. Temperature changes, causing expansion and contraction, were invisible processes, so the sudden sound felt like announcement rather than physics. Another mistaken belief held that if two flames in separate rooms flickered simultaneously, it meant unseen currents connected the spaces spiritually. Shared air pressure changes were less compelling than invisible threads, binding households together. Some believed that if a person found themselves humming the same melody at the same hour each day, it meant time itself carried memory. Habit and routine were framed as external influence. There was also the idea that if rain tapped rhythmically on rooftops in repeating patterns, it was forming coded language. The human tendency to detect rhythm in randomness made this interpretation persuasive. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that if a person's reflection in still water appeared briefly darker than expected, it meant unresolved thought lingered within them. Variations in cloud cover or angle of light became introspective signals. Medieval belief systems continued to transform even the most subtle human experiences into meaningful signals. Many people believed that if a person suddenly felt a chill run down their spine without visible cause, it meant a spirit had passed close by. Today we might attribute such sensations to nervous system responses or temperature shifts. But in the Middle Ages, unexplained bodily reactions were rarely considered random. They were woven into the spiritual fabric of daily life. There was also the idea that if two people reached for the same object at the same moment, fate was guiding their connection. Timing, especially synchronized timing, felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. Shared motion became symbolic alignment. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a lantern's light appeared dimmer in one corner of a room, it indicated spiritual heaviness in that space. Variations in airflow or wick angle created uneven illumination, but shadow was rarely interpreted as mere physics. Another mistaken belief held that when dogs barked at empty space, they were perceiving invisible visitors. Animals' heightened senses allowed them to detect sounds or smells humans could not perceive, but this was interpreted as spiritual sight rather than biological sensitivity. Some believed that if frost formed intricate symmetrical shapes on stone, it meant divine artistry had briefly touched the earth. The beauty of crystalline formation felt intentional rather than a natural result of temperature and moisture. There was also a conviction that if a person frequently forgot what they were about to say, it meant unseen forces were withholding knowledge for protection. Momentary lapses of memory were framed as guidance rather than cognitive interruption. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a bell rope snapped unexpectedly, it signalled imbalance in the moral order of the parish. The mechanical wear of rope fibres was secondary to symbolic meaning. Another misconception involved the assumption that if two fires lit from the same source burned differently, it reflected difference in the purity of materials rather than variations in airflow or fuel density. Some believed that if someone tripped while crossing a bridge, the river spirit beneath had momentarily grasped them. Slippery wood or uneven planks were interpreted as intention. There was also the idea that certain birds circling overhead during travel meant destiny was observing the journey. Birds riding thermals were seen as watchers, rather than simply creatures responding to air currents. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that tears shed during prayer physically strengthened the words spoken. Emotion was thought to add weight and force to language. Another, mistaken belief held that if wind entered a house from the north, it carried heavier spiritual influence than wind from other directions. Cardinal directions were assigned personality traits. Some believed that if two strangers shared the same birthday, their lives were intertwined in unseen ways. Coincidence in date felt too precise to be accidental. There was also the conviction that shadows cast by candlelight during storytelling could reveal hidden truths about the tale itself. The shifting shapes on walls appeared animated and responsive. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if the moon appeared surrounded by a ring of light, it was a warning of conflict or change. While lunar halos are caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere, they were interpreted as celestial signs. Another misconception involved the belief that if a person's footsteps echoed more loudly than usual, it meant destiny was amplifying their presence. Acoustic resonance in stone corridors became personal signal. Some thought that if a household cat avoided a particular room repeatedly, it meant unseen forces lingered there. Animal behavior driven by scent or temperature was layered with supernatural explanation. There was also the idea that if a flame bent consistently toward one person in a gathering, it signified that they carried unresolved burdens. Subtle drafts became moral indicators. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a child spoke in their sleep, they were communicating with ancestral spirits. Sleep talking was seen as channeling rather than neurological phenomenon. Another mistaken belief suggested that if two clouds collided in the sky, it was evidence of heavenly disagreement. The shifting forms of vapor became narrative drama. Some believed that placing a bowl of water under a bed at night could absorb bad dreams. The stillness of water symbolized containment. There was also the conviction that if someone laughed unexpectedly during solemn discussion, it meant invisible tricksters were influencing them. Nervous laughter was externalized into mischievous forces. Medieval thinkers often treated repetition as proof. If a sequence of events happened twice, it was no longer coincidence. It was pattern, and pattern implied intention. Another misconception held that if a person's voice cracked during important speech, it signaled spiritual interference. Physical strain was interpreted as metaphysical disruption. Some believed that if wind extinguished a torch just as someone entered a room, it meant secrets were present. Air movement and combustion were less compelling explanations than hidden truth. There was also the idea that if dew gathered more thickly on certain plants than others, those plants carried special energy. Variations in surface texture were interpreted symbolically. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if they felt sudden drowsiness at twilight, it meant spirits were drawing near. The natural shift in circadian rhythm was seen as vulnerability. Another mistaken belief involved the assumption that if two candles produced identical shadows side by side, harmony was guaranteed in the household. Symmetry in light became symbol of unity. Some thought that if a person frequently heard faint music in quiet moments, it meant heavenly forces were nearby. Auditory imagination blended with spiritual interpretation. There was also the conviction that if a rooster crowed before dawn earlier than usual, it meant time itself was shifting slightly. Seasonal daylight variation was attributed to cosmic adjustment. All these beliefs, layered upon one another, created a world dense with meaning. Medieval people did not live in emptiness or randomness. They inhabited a universe alive with signs. Every flicker, echo, ripple, or coincidence could be interpreted as communication. Their framework may seem fantastical now, yet it arose from careful observation filtered through limited scientific knowledge and strong symbolic tradition. They noticed patterns, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, and built explanations that fit within their worldview. The medieval world teaches us that certainty is often built from repetition and shared belief rather than measured evidence. It reminds us that human beings naturally connect cause and effect, even when the connection does not truly exist. And perhaps the most fascinating realization is that this instinct has not vanished. Even in modern times, people still look for meaning in chance events. The tools have changed, the explanations have evolved, but the desire to interpret, to transform uncertainty into narrative, remains deeply human. What once sounded undeniably true in the Middle Ages now sounds curious and imaginative. Yet those beliefs were sincere attempts to understand a mysterious world. They were stepping stones in the long journey of knowledge, a journey that continues, reshaping certainty with each new discovery. Medieval belief stretched endlessly into the unnoticed spaces between events, filling silence with interpretation and coincidence with intention. Many people believed that if a person's name was spoken accidentally in conversation without context, it meant that person's spirit had briefly entered the minds of the speakers. The strange experience of a name surfacing unexpectedly felt too deliberate to be random memory association. There was also the belief that if a single star appeared earlier than the others at dusk, it was watching more closely than the rest. The evening star, often the planet Venus, stood out brightly, and its early presence felt purposeful rather than orbital. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a draught of wind moved through tall grass in ripples without visible source, unseen travellers were passing through. The motion of nature suggested hidden movement. Another mistaken belief held that if someone felt sudden thirst during prayer, It meant their soul required purification. Normal bodily signals were interpreted as spiritual feedback. Some believed that if two people finished each other's sentences, it proved their souls were harmonized beyond ordinary connection. Shared language patterns were seen as destiny rather than familiarity. There was also the idea that if a flame crackled loudly while cooking, it meant secrets were being discussed nearby. The unpredictable popping of wood sap in fire felt responsive to conversation. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that shadows could absorb fragments of speech. Speaking harsh words near someone's shadow was thought to stain their spirit indirectly. Another misconception involved the assumption that if a well bucket returned slightly warmer than expected, it meant the earth below was stirring with unseen forces. Temperature differences caused by sunlight exposure were interpreted symbolically. Some believed that if a horse shook its mane repeatedly before a journey, it sensed coming misfortune. Natural animal behavior became prophetic gesture. There was also the conviction that certain stones hummed faintly at night, especially near burial grounds, indicating communication beneath the soil. Medieval belief systems continued to transform even the most subtle human experiences into meaningful signals. Many people believed that if a person suddenly felt a chill run down their spine without visible cause, it meant a spirit had passed close by. Today we might attribute such sensations to nervous system responses or temperature shifts. But in the Middle Ages, unexplained bodily reactions were rarely considered random. They were woven into the spiritual fabric of daily life. There was also the idea that if two people reached for the same object at the same moment, fate was guiding their connection. Timing, especially synchronized timing, felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. Shared motion became symbolic alignment. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a lantern's light appeared dimmer in one corner of a room, it indicated spiritual heaviness in that space. Variations in airflow or wick angle created uneven illumination, but shadow was rarely interpreted as mere physics. Another mistaken belief held that when dogs barked at empty space, they were perceiving invisible visitors. Animals' heightened senses allowed them to detect sounds or smells humans could not perceive, but this was interpreted as spiritual sight rather than biological sensitivity. Some believed that if frost formed intricate symmetrical shapes on stone, it meant divine artistry had briefly touched the earth. The beauty of crystalline formation felt intentional rather than a natural result of temperature and moisture. There was also a conviction that if a person frequently forgot what they were about to say, it meant unseen forces were withholding knowledge for protection. Momentary lapses of memory were framed as guidance rather than cognitive interruption. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a bell rope snapped unexpectedly, it signaled imbalance in the moral order of the parish. The mechanical wear of rope fibers was secondary to symbolic meaning. Another misconception involved the assumption that if two fires lit from the same source burned differently, it reflected difference in the purity of materials rather than variations in airflow or fuel density. Some believed that if someone tripped while crossing a bridge, the river spirit beneath had momentarily grasped them. Slippery wood or uneven planks were interpreted as intention. There was also the idea that certain birds circling overhead during travel meant destiny was observing the journey. Birds riding thermals were seen as watchers, rather than simply creatures responding to air currents. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that tears shed during prayer physically strengthened the words spoken. Emotion was thought to add weight and force to language. Another mistaken belief held that if wind entered a house from the north, it carried heavier spiritual influence than wind from other directions. Cardinal directions were assigned personality traits. Some believed that if two strangers shared the same birthday, their lives were intertwined in unseen ways. Coincidence in date felt too precise to be accidental. There was also the conviction that shadows cast by candlelight during storytelling could reveal hidden truths about the tale itself. The shifting shapes on walls appeared animated and responsive. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if the moon appeared surrounded by a ring of light, it was a warning of conflict or change. While lunar halos are caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere, they were interpreted as celestial signs. Another misconception involved the belief that if a person's footsteps echoed more loudly than usual, it meant destiny was amplifying their presence. Acoustic resonance in stone corridors became personal signal. Some thought that if a household cat avoided a particular room repeatedly, it meant unseen forces lingered there. Animal behavior driven by scent or temperature was layered with supernatural explanation. There was also the idea that if a flame bent consistently toward one person in a gathering, it signified that they carried unresolved burdens. Subtle drafts became moral indicators. Medieval communities sometimes believed that if a child spoke in their sleep, they were communicating with ancestral spirits. Sleep talking was seen as channeling rather than neurological phenomenon. Another mistaken belief suggested that if two clouds collided in the sky, it was evidence of heavenly disagreement. The shifting forms of vapor became narrative drama. Some believed that placing a bowl of water under a bed at night could absorb bad dreams. The stillness of water symbolized containment. There was also the conviction that if someone laughed unexpectedly during solemn discussion, it meant invisible tricksters were influencing them. Nervous laughter was externalized into mischievous forces. Medieval thinkers often treated repetition as proof. If a sequence of events happened twice, it was no longer coincidence. It was pattern, and pattern implied intention. Another misconception held that if a person's voice cracked during important speech, it signaled spiritual interference. Physical strain was interpreted as metaphysical disruption. Some believed that if wind extinguished a torch just as someone entered a room, it meant secrets were present. Air movement and combustion were less compelling explanations than hidden truth. There was also the idea that if dew gathered more thickly on certain plants than others, those plants carried special energy. Variations in surface texture were interpreted symbolically. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if they felt sudden drowsiness at twilight, it meant spirits were drawing near. The natural shift in circadian rhythm was seen as vulnerability. Another mistaken belief involved the assumption that if two candles produced identical shadows side by side, harmony was guaranteed in the household. Symmetry in light became symbol of unity. Some thought that if a person frequently heard faint music in quiet moments, it meant heavenly forces were nearby. Auditory imagination blended with spiritual interpretation. There was also the conviction that if a rooster crowed before dawn earlier than usual, it meant time itself was shifting slightly. Seasonal daylight variation was attributed to cosmic adjustment. All these beliefs, layered upon one another, created a world dense with meaning. Medieval people did not live in emptiness or randomness. They inhabited a universe alive with signs. Every flicker, echo, ripple, or coincidence could be interpreted as communication. Their framework may seem fantastical now, yet it arose from careful observation filtered through limited scientific knowledge and strong symbolic tradition. They noticed patterns, sometimes real, sometimes imagined, and built explanations that fit within their worldview. The medieval world teaches us that certainty is often built from repetition and shared belief rather than measured evidence. It reminds us that human beings naturally connect cause and effect, even when the connection does not truly exist. And perhaps the most fascinating realization is that this instinct has not vanished. Even in modern times, people still look for meaning in chance events. The tools have changed, the explanations have evolved, but the desire to interpret, to transform uncertainty into narrative, remains deeply human. What once sounded undeniably true in the Middle Ages now sounds curious and imaginative, yet those beliefs were sincere attempts to understand a mysterious world. They were stepping stones in the long journey of knowledge, a journey that continues, reshaping certainty with each new discovery. Medieval belief stretched endlessly into the unnoticed spaces between events, filling silence with interpretation and coincidence with intention. Many people believed that if a person's name was spoken accidentally in conversation without context, it meant that person's spirit had briefly entered the minds of the speakers. The strange experience of a name surfacing unexpectedly felt too deliberate to be random memory association. There was also the belief that if a single star appeared earlier than the others at dusk, it was watching more closely than the rest. The evening star, often the planet Venus, stood out brightly, and its early presence felt purposeful rather than orbital. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if a draught of wind moved through tall grass in ripples without visible source, unseen travellers were passing through. The motion of nature suggested hidden movement. Another mistaken belief held that if someone felt sudden thirst during prayer, it meant their soul required purification. Normal bodily signals were interpreted as spiritual feedback. Some believed that if two people finished each other's sentences, it proved their souls were harmonized beyond ordinary connection. Shared language patterns were seen as destiny rather than familiarity. There was also the idea that if a flame crackled loudly while cooking, it meant secrets were being discussed nearby. The unpredictable popping of wood sap in fire felt responsive to conversation. Medieval thought sometimes extended to the belief that shadows could absorb fragments of speech. Speaking harsh words near someone's shadow was thought to stain their spirit indirectly. Another misconception involved the assumption that if a well bucket returned slightly warmer than expected, it meant the earth below was stirring with unseen forces. Temperature differences caused by sunlight exposure were interpreted symbolically. Some believed that if a horse shook its mane repeatedly before a journey, it sensed coming misfortune. Natural animal behavior became prophetic gesture. There was also the conviction that certain stones hummed faintly at night, especially near burial grounds, indicating communication beneath the soil. Medieval belief did not stop at grand cosmic theories or dramatic supernatural explanations. It reached into gestures, habits, and even the smallest interruptions of daily life. Many people believed that stumbling while walking was not simple clumsiness, but a warning from unseen forces. If someone tripped before beginning a journey, it was sometimes taken as a sign to delay departure. Since accidents occasionally preceded misfortune, memory strengthened the connection between stumble and danger, even though most stumbles led to nothing at all. There was also a belief that a sudden gust of wind indoors meant an invisible presence had entered the room. Drafts caused by pressure differences or open doors were not easily understood, especially in stone buildings where airflow patterns were unpredictable. The sensation of wind without visible source invited supernatural explanation. Medieval households sometimes believed that if a loaf of bread cracked in a particular pattern while baking, it revealed the mood of the household. Since bread was central to daily survival, its appearance felt symbolic. Variations in oven heat or dough moisture became moral signals rather than practical results. Another misconception involved the idea that if a candle extinguished itself without obvious cause, it meant someone had spoken a lie nearby. The fragility of flame made it a convenient indicator of invisible forces. Air currents or insufficient wax supply were secondary to symbolic interpretation. It was also believed that certain doorways were more spiritually active than others, especially thresholds crossed frequently. Thresholds represented transition between spaces, and repeated crossing imbued them with imagined energy. If someone felt uneasy near a doorway, that sensation was interpreted as lingering presence rather than simple architecture. Medieval people often assumed that recurring dreams about falling indicated the soul temporarily losing connection to the body. The physical sensation of jerking awake during sleep, what we now understand as a hypnic jerk, felt like proof that the soul had nearly drifted too far. Another belief suggested that carrying a small mirror could deflect curses, because reflective surfaces symbolically returned negative energy to its source. When no harm followed suspected ill will, the mirror received credit. Some believed that if a rooster crowed at unusual hours, it signaled disruption in the spiritual balance of the community. While roosters may crow due to light changes or noise, irregular timing seemed meaningful in quiet villages. Medieval farmers sometimes thought that shadows cast by trees at noon marked hidden underground springs or buried treasure. The shape and density of shade became clues not just to sunlight, but to imagined secrets beneath the soil. There was also the idea that echoes heard from wells were voices of trapped spirits beneath the earth. Wells were deep, dark, and resonant. The way sound reverberated felt alive rather than acoustic. Another mistaken assumption was that the warmth of a recently vacated chair meant a spirit lingered briefly in the place where someone had sat. Physical heat retention was interpreted as residual presence. It was believed that if two candles burned at exactly the same height for a prolonged time, it meant harmony between two people in the room. Slight variations in wax melting were seen as relationship indicators rather than simple coincidence. Medieval superstition also included the belief that if a person's shadow did not align with their body at sunset, it meant spiritual imbalance. Because shadows stretch and distort dramatically at low angles of light, misalignment seemed suspicious. There was the conviction that knocking on wood prevented misfortune, because wood retained memory of sacred trees. When misfortune failed to occur after such a gesture, the ritual was reinforced. Some believed that the sudden silence of birds in a forest meant unseen watchers were near. While birds quiet down in response to predators or environmental changes, silence was interpreted as warning of supernatural rather than natural threat. Another belief held that iron nails driven into walls protected against disease because iron symbolized permanence. The metal's strength was assumed transferable to human health. Medieval communities also sometimes believed that milk boiling over-signaled emotional tension in the home. Since boiling can be unpredictable, depending on heat and vessel shape, overflow felt dramatic and symbolic. It was thought that if a person's reflection appeared, distorted in polished metal, it revealed internal moral corruption. Imperfections in surface polish were interpreted as flaws in character. Another mistaken idea was that thunder rolling for a long duration indicated angels moving heavy objects across the sky. The rumble seemed too purposeful to be simple atmospheric disturbance. Some believed that placing shoes pointing outward at the door prevented spirits from entering because directionality confused them. When nights passed peacefully, the arrangement was credited. There was also the assumption that if a clock tick sounded louder at night, it meant time itself slowed in darkness. Quiet surroundings simply amplified perception, but it felt as though time behaved differently. Medieval belief even extended to the idea that certain letters written with particular flourish carried more spiritual weight. Script style was not merely aesthetic, but influential in unseen ways. Another misconception suggested that if two people spoke the same word simultaneously, it meant their souls were temporarily aligned. The coincidence felt too precise to be random. Communities believed that the first person seen on New Year's morning determined the year's fortune. Social interaction thus became omen rather than routine. It was also thought that smoke rising straight upward indicated divine approval, while smoke drifting sideways signaled displeasure. Wind direction became moral indicator. Some believed that if a person's footsteps echoed unusually loudly in a corridor, it meant destiny was drawing attention to them. Acoustic resonance was interpreted as cosmic focus. Another belief held that water drawn from a well at midnight possessed stronger healing properties than water drawn at noon. The mystery of night imbued ordinary water with imagined potency. Medieval thinking often merged pattern with purpose. Repetition became evidence. Coincidence became causation. Symbol became mechanism. What unites all these false yet convincing beliefs is the human instinct to interpret the world narratively. Medieval society lived within an interconnected web of meaning. Nothing was neutral. Everything signified something beyond itself. Without instruments to isolate variables or measure unseen forces, perception became authority. Cultural agreement reinforced interpretation. Over time, shared assumptions solidified into unquestioned truth. And yet, beneath these misconceptions was an enduring quality, curiosity. Medieval people asked why bread cracked, why wind shifted, why echoes answered, why shadows stretched. Their answers were shaped by limited tools, but their questions were sincere. The medieval world was not irrational, it was interpretive. It sought coherence in chaos and intention in accident. Many of its explanations were wrong by modern standards, but they were steps in humanity's ongoing attempt to understand existence. Centuries later, with microscopes, telescopes, and equations, we see further. But the impulse remains the same. We still search for meaning in randomness, for story in silence, for cause in coincidence. The medieval past reminds us that certainty often grows from repetition, not proof, and that today's obvious truth may one day become tomorrow's fascinating misconception. Medieval belief systems continued to weave meaning into the smallest disruptions of daily rhythm. Many people assumed that if a door creaked loudly without being touched, it meant unseen forces were testing the household. Wood expands and contracts with humidity, yet in candlelit rooms where silence was common, such sounds felt deliberate rather than mechanical. When no harm followed, the house was considered protected. When misfortune came later, the earlier creak was remembered as warning. There was also the belief that spilled water near a hearth indicated emotional imbalance in the family. Because water and fire symbolized opposing elements, their accidental mixing seemed meaningful. The unpredictability of domestic life found symbolic explanation in the language of the elements. Medieval villagers sometimes believed that if bread dough failed to rise, it was because someone nearby harbored resentment. Yeast fermentation was invisible and poorly understood. When dough succeeded one day and failed another, social tension became the suspected cause. Suspicion often fell upon outsiders or unpopular neighbors, reinforcing social divisions. Another misconception held that if a person's name was written and erased repeatedly, it could weaken their vitality. Writing was seen as an extension of identity, and to alter it physically felt like altering the person. In a culture where literacy was powerful and rare, script carried almost magical significance. It was also believed that if two candles merged into one flame, it symbolized future union between two individuals. The physics of melting wax created occasional merging, but symbolism shaped interpretation more strongly than chemistry. Medieval communities often thought that shadows cast at different times of year reflected changes in moral condition. Since shadow length varies seasonally due to the sun's angle, the gradual change seemed to mirror spiritual cycles. There was also a conviction that certain echoes in narrow alleyways were signs of past events replaying themselves. Medieval belief systems also shaped how people interpreted silence, coincidence, and even simple bodily sensations. Many assumed that a sudden ringing in the ears meant someone far away was speaking about them, because the sensation appeared without visible cause and faded just as mysteriously. It felt like a signal, rather than a random neurological event. If news later arrived connected to a person they had been thinking about, memory fused the two moments into proof. Another persistent belief was that certain stones fell from the sky during thunderstorms, because lightning physically broke pieces from the heavens. Meteorites were sometimes interpreted as fragments of celestial fire, rather than natural space debris. Since lightning was dramatic, and meteors rare, combining the two into one explanation felt coherent. Medieval communities also believed that the human body emitted invisible rays from the eyes when looking at something intensely. Vision was thought to function partly by projecting outward, not just receiving light. Because staring can feel physically forceful, it seemed plausible that eyes sent something tangible into the world. This idea also supported belief in the evil eye, where a harmful gaze could cause sickness or misfortune. Another misconception involved the belief that sneezing expelled fragments of the soul. Blessing someone after a sneeze was more than politeness. It was a protective response. Sneezing was sudden and involuntary, momentarily disrupting breath. Since breath and spirit were closely linked in medieval thought, the act appeared spiritually risky. There was also the assumption that mountains were permanent and unchanging because they symbolized divine stability. The idea that landscapes could dramatically shift over long periods was difficult to imagine. Without geological knowledge of erosion or tectonics, mountains seemed eternal. Their solid presence reinforced the belief that the earth itself was fixed and immovable. Medieval thinkers sometimes believed that laughter from infants was evidence of angels entertaining them. Since babies could not articulate speech, their sudden smiles and giggles appeared mysterious and delightful. Rather than neurological development, supernatural companionship offered explanation. Another widespread idea was that illness could arise from imbalance between hot and cold foods consumed in improper combinations. While nutrition does affect health, medieval dietary theory often treated food properties as elemental forces interacting dramatically inside the body. A cold food eaten after a hot one might be blamed for fever or discomfort, even if no scientific basis existed. It was also believed that fog near graveyards carried lingering spirits of the deceased. Mist hovering over burial grounds created an eerie atmosphere, especially in early morning light. Natural condensation patterns were interpreted through spiritual expectation. Some communities assumed that coins bent or tarnished in the presence of dishonesty. If a merchant handled money and it later appeared damaged, suspicion of moral corruption followed. The symbolic connection between value and virtue made the idea compelling. Another medieval misconception involved the belief that silence at certain hours of the night signaled supernatural activity. Midnight was often considered a threshold moment when natural laws weakened. If dogs barked suddenly or wind shifted at that time, the events were interpreted as signs rather than coincidence. In agriculture, farmers sometimes believed that planting seeds during a thunderstorm infused them with strength from the storm's energy. The dramatic power of thunder suggested vitality. If crops grew well afterward, the storm received credit. There was also the notion that a person's reflection in water could reveal hidden truth about their character. Rippling distortions were interpreted symbolically rather than physically. If a reflection appeared broken or unclear, it might be taken as a sign of internal disorder. Medieval physicians occasionally believed that the human body glowed faintly with invisible light, and that illness dimmed this radiance. While this sounds mystical, it was rooted in the idea that life itself was a kind of internal flame. The warmth of the body compared to cold stone reinforced that metaphor. Another mistaken assumption was that wolves howled specifically to summon spirits of the dead. Their haunting nighttime cries echoed across valleys, easily fitting into spiritual narrative. The behavior, natural communication among animals, became layered with supernatural meaning. Some believed that iron tools left outdoors during eclipses absorbed negative celestial energy. Objects exposed to unusual sky events were thought vulnerable. Since eclipses were rare and frightening, extra caution seemed wise. Medieval scholars also thought that certain scents travelled faster than light, carrying information across distances before visual confirmation. Smell often arrives before sight in certain contexts, such as smoke from fire. This observation led to exaggerated conclusions about the speed and agency of scent. Another belief suggested that a person who walked backward at night could confuse pursuing spirits. Reversing normal movement symbolically reversed spiritual threat. The ritual provided psychological reassurance in dark, uncertain spaces. It was also thought that tears shed in anger were heavier than tears shed in sorrow because they contained different humoral compositions. The physical difference was imagined though never measured. Emotional distinction became chemical assumption. Some medieval people believed that the shape of flames in a hearth predicted the mood of the coming day. A flickering flame leaning east or west was interpreted as an omen. Since fire responds to airflow, small drafts created patterns that invited meaning. There was also a conviction that certain colours in the sky at sunset revealed moral judgment upon communities. A particularly red sunset might be seen as warning or divine signal. Atmospheric scattering of light, though real, was not understood in optical terms. Medieval natural philosophy sometimes included the idea that shadows cast at dawn were purer than those at dusk. Morning light symbolized renewal, while evening suggested decline. The physical similarity of shadows was overshadowed by symbolic association. Another mistaken belief was that holding metal objects during a storm protected against lightning, because metal symbolized strength. Ironically, this could increase risk, but the symbolism of durability overshadowed electrical reality. Communities also believed that footprints left in mud contained a portion of the walker's essence. Destroying those prints could symbolically harm the individual. The impression of form in earth felt like a temporary extension of the body. Even the act of storytelling carried belief in literal transformation. It was thought that recounting tragic events repeatedly could summon them again, as if narrative itself shaped reality. While retelling can reinforce memory and emotion, the assumption extended into causation. All of these beliefs, whether about sky, body, earth, or sound, reflect a worldview built on connection. Medieval reasoning sought harmony between the visible and invisible. When something unexpected occurred, explanation gravitated towards spiritual, elemental, or symbolic cause. What makes these ideas enduringly fascinating is that they reveal how humans interpret uncertainty. In the absence of measurement tools and experimental frameworks, imagination becomes method. Observation becomes narrative. Analogy becomes evidence. The medieval world was not devoid of curiosity or intelligence. It was rich with both. But curiosity operated within boundaries defined by tradition and theology. Each false belief was a stepping stone, part of a long path toward clearer understanding. And perhaps the most humbling realization is this. Just as medieval thinkers felt certain of their explanations, we too live within frameworks, shaped by our own era's assumptions. History teaches not only what was wrong, but how easily conviction can feel like truth when supported by culture, authority, and repetition. Medieval belief extended even into the smallest, most ordinary details of life, turning everyday sensations into signs and symbols. Many people assumed that an unexpected itch in the palm meant money was about to arrive or leave, because financial gain and loss often happened unpredictably, attaching a physical sensation to economic fortune made randomness feel meaningful. If someone received payment shortly after their hand itched, the memory fused the two events into evidence. Another belief held that candles flickering indoors without visible draft signaled the presence of unseen spirits. Since airflow is often subtle and imperceptible, flames that bent or trembled seemed to react to invisible beings rather than currents of air. The movement of light in darkness was dramatic, and darkness already carried symbolic weight. Medieval communities also believed that iron keys placed under a pillow could prevent nightmares. Keys symbolized control and authority. Placing one near the head felt like locking the mind against intrusion. When a person slept peacefully after such a ritual, the object was credited rather than natural variation in dream cycles. There was also the idea that certain birds flying unusually low predicted plague or famine because animals sometimes alter behavior before storms due to pressure changes. Occasional coincidences between bird patterns and weather reinforced broader predictions about disaster. Over time, isolated correlations hardened into certainty. Some believed that the cracking of wooden beams in houses during cold nights meant spirits were walking above. Even deeper within medieval thinking were beliefs that shaped how people interpreted everyday sensations, accidents, and coincidences. Many assumed that hiccups were caused by tiny spirits or sudden disturbances of internal winds rather than muscular spasms. Because hiccups appeared abruptly and disappeared just as mysteriously, they felt like minor invasions rather than simple biological reflexes. Folk remedies often focused on startling the person as if fear would frighten away the unseen cause. When the hiccup stopped after a sudden shock, the method seemed validated. Another belief centered on the idea that mirrors possessed spiritual depth. Some medieval people feared that mirrors could trap fragments of the soul or allow spirits to pass through. The reflective surface appeared to contain a second world, one that perfectly mimicked reality. Since optics were poorly understood, reflection seemed almost magical. Breaking a mirror was sometimes associated with bad fortune, not because of superstition alone, but because it symbolized damaging something that held a mysterious inner reality. Medieval communities also believed that certain illnesses were caused by fairy arrows or invisible darts shot by supernatural beings. Sudden sharp pains, particularly those without visible injury, were attributed to these mystical projectiles. The pain felt immediate and unexplained, so it was easier to imagine a hidden strike than to consider nerve inflammation or muscle spasm. Without anatomical knowledge of nerves, invisible arrows provided a vivid explanation. Another common assumption was that animals behaved according to strict moral symbolism rather than instinct. Foxes were believed to embody calculated deceit in a literal sense, while wolves were seen as embodiments of greed. Although these symbolic associations persist in storytelling, medieval people sometimes blurred metaphor and biological reality. Animal behavior was interpreted through moral narrative rather than ecological understanding. There was also the belief that hair and nails continued to grow after death because of lingering life force, while dehydration of the skin creates the illusion of growth. Medieval observers interpreted it as proof that vitality persisted in small amounts even after the soul departed. This reinforced the idea that life faded gradually rather than ending abruptly. In rural folklore, Some believed that shadows could detach from the body and act independently. A person whose shadow appeared distorted or elongated was thought to be spiritually vulnerable. Since shadows shift dramatically with changing light, their unpredictable shapes encouraged imaginative explanation. The connection between body and shadow seemed fragile and mysterious. Another misconception involved the idea that earthquakes were caused by underground winds trapped beneath the Earth's crust. Since wind above ground produced noise and movement, it was logical to assume that similar forces below ground created tremors. The rumbling sound accompanying earthquakes strengthened this analogy. Without knowledge of tectonic plates, subterranean air currents were a plausible guess. Medieval seafarers sometimes believed that whistling aboard a ship would summon storms. The sound of wind in sails combined with superstition to form the belief that imitating wind invited real wind. If a storm followed someone's whistle, memory preserved the connection, while ignoring countless times when nothing happened. Sailors, already living in dangerous conditions, relied on rituals to feel control over uncontrollable seas. Another widespread idea was that blood carried not only life, but personality itself. Drinking the blood of a brave animal was thought to transfer courage. Since blood was visibly associated with vitality, it seemed to contain essence beyond oxygen transport. The dramatic nature of blood loss reinforced its perceived power. Medieval scholars also believed that fogs and mists were transitional zones where spirits moved between realms. Reduced visibility heightened anxiety, and strange shapes in mist encouraged imagination. The environment itself appeared liminal, neither fully visible nor entirely hidden. Natural atmospheric conditions thus acquired metaphysical significance. In domestic life, it was believed that placing certain objects beneath pillows could influence dreams. Herbs, small charms, or written prayers were thought to guide visions toward prophecy or protection. Since dreams can be influenced by suggestion, any dream resembling expectation reinforced belief in the object's power. Another mistaken assumption concerned fossils. Medieval observers who found large fossilized bones often concluded they belonged to giants described in legends. Without understanding extinction or prehistoric species, enormous bones seemed to confirm ancient tales of towering humans or mythical beasts. The physical evidence aligned with narrative tradition. Some communities believed that the north direction itself carried inherent cold energy that could weaken travelers. While climate patterns do vary geographically, the idea that direction possessed moral or physical force extended beyond environmental explanation. Orientation was imbued with symbolic value. Medieval physicians sometimes assumed that a person's pulse directly revealed their moral condition. A rapid pulse might be interpreted as spiritual agitation rather than physiological stress. Since emotion does affect heart rate, the confusion between moral state and physical response felt justified. Another belief was that fire was a purifying element, not only symbolically, but literally capable of cleansing moral corruption. While fire can sterilize objects, applying it as a universal purifier extended metaphor into assumed moral physics. The destructive power of flame seemed capable of removing invisible stain. There was also a conviction that echoes in caves were responses from hidden beings, rather than reflected sound waves. When voices returned altered and distorted, it felt like communication rather than physics. In environments where acoustics were mysterious, spiritual interpretation filled the gap. Medieval thinkers sometimes believed that human thought itself generated physical heat measurable in the skull. Intense concentration was thought to warm the head because intellectual effort was linked to fire as an element. Since thinking can produce slight physiological changes, metaphor blended with assumed mechanism. The belief that certain constellations physically influenced crop flavor also circulated in agricultural lore. A harvest gathered under a particular star alignment was thought to taste sweeter or store longer. Variations in soil and climate were real, but celestial timing was credited for outcomes beyond its influence. In matters of justice, some believed that a corpse would bleed anew in the presence of its murderer. During investigations, suspects were sometimes brought near a body to observe whether wounds would reopen. If blood appeared, guilt was assumed. The phenomenon could be explained by natural fluid shifts, but the dramatic spectacle reinforced faith in divine revelation. Medieval artisans believed that bells rung during storms could disperse lightning. Since sound is powerful and lightning frightening, ringing church bells felt like an active defense. When storms passed after ringing, it seemed proof of success. Even though storms naturally move on, another assumption was that illness could be predicted by the shape of clouds at sunrise. Since weather patterns sometimes correlate with climate shifts, occasional accuracy strengthened belief that clouds foretold disease outbreaks. Pattern recognition once again overshadowed controlled study. What binds all these beliefs together is not absurdity, but narrative coherence. Medieval society sought order in every phenomenon. When something happened suddenly or without visible cause, explanation flowed towards spiritual, symbolic, or elemental reasoning. Without instruments to measure microbes, pressure systems, gravity, or neurological impulses, imagination bridged the gap between observation and certainty. The medieval era reminds us that humans are meaning-making creatures. Faced with uncertainty, we construct explanations that feel consistent with what we already know. Those explanations can endure for centuries if rarely challenged. The world of medieval belief was rich, intricate, and profoundly human. It was a tapestry woven from observation, fear, faith, authority, and wonder. And although many of its threads were mistaken, they reveal something timeless, the desire to understand a mysterious world with whatever tools are at hand. Medieval thought also extended into countless smaller assumptions that shaped how people interpreted their daily experiences. Many believed that yawning created a temporary opening through which evil spirits could enter the body. This is why covering one's mouth became both a polite and protective gesture. Since yawning leaves a person briefly vulnerable and unaware, the action seemed like a gateway. When someone fell ill after a period of fatigue, it reinforced the idea that spiritual forces had taken advantage of physical weakness. Another widespread belief was that a person's breath carried fragments of their soul. Breathing was visibly tied to life. When breath stopped, life ended. It therefore seemed logical that breath was not merely air but spiritual essence. In some traditions, breathing upon an object or person was thought to transfer power, blessing, or curse. The symbolic connection between breath and spirit felt undeniable because both were invisible yet essential. Medieval people also believed that certain trees possessed consciousness or memory. Ancient oaks, in particular, were thought to witness and remember human events, because trees lived far longer than humans. Medieval society was layered with assumptions that felt grounded in observation, tradition, and religious conviction. Yet many of them were profoundly mistaken. One widespread belief was that the human body was directly influenced by the alignment of the zodiac at the moment of birth in a way that permanently shaped health and temperament. While astrology had already been mentioned as a guiding force in decision, making its medical application was especially detailed. Physicians sometimes refused to perform surgeries unless the moon was in a favorable sign, believing certain zodiac signs governed specific body parts. For example, Aries was linked to the head, Taurus to the neck, and so on. The reasoning appeared internally consistent. If the cosmos was perfectly ordered, then the human body, considered a microcosm of the universe, must reflect that order. The symmetry was elegant, and elegance often felt like truth. Another commonly accepted belief was that laughter could literally cure serious illness because joy restored spiritual balance. While positive emotion can certainly affect well-being, medieval interpretations sometimes elevated this to a near miraculous principle. If someone recovered after a period of happiness or religious reassurance, their recovery was attributed to moral alignment rather than the body's natural immune processes. The blending of spiritual and physical health blurred the boundaries between emotional state and biological cause. Many medieval thinkers believed that metals grew inside the earth, the way plants grew in soil. Gold, silver, and iron were thought to be immature or mature stages of the same substance, developing over time in underground veins. This idea supported alchemical theory. If metals naturally evolved, then human intervention might accelerate their perfection. The earth itself was imagined as a living organism with circulatory systems and generative powers. Without knowledge of geological processes, mineral formation appeared organic rather than chemical. Another belief that seemed convincing involved the idea that language itself reflected divine design. Some scholars argued that the original human language, often associated with the language spoken before the biblical Tower of Babel, perfectly corresponded to the true nature of objects. Words were not arbitrary labels, but intrinsic expressions of essence. Therefore, studying language was seen as uncovering hidden truth about reality. While language certainly shapes thought, the assumption that vocabulary encoded divine structure was philosophically appealing but unfounded. Medieval weather explanations were also shaped by limited understanding. Thunderstorms were often attributed to clashes of celestial forces or the anger of spiritual beings. Lightning striking a building was interpreted as divine judgment rather than atmospheric electricity. Since storms were unpredictable and powerful, they inspired moral interpretation. Communities sometimes organized prayers specifically to calm the skies, and if the storm passed, as storms eventually do, the ritual seemed validated. In the realm of reproduction, many believed that the mother's imagination during pregnancy could physically shape the unborn child. If a pregnant woman saw something frightening or unusual, it was thought that the image could imprint onto the baby's body. Birthmarks, deformities, or unusual features were explained this way. The logic emerged from the strong emotional connection between mother and child, but it confused psychological influence with biological development. Another widely held assumption was that the stars were fixed lights embedded in a solid heavenly dome. Since the night sky appeared constant and orderly, it seemed impossible that stars were distant suns scattered across vast space. The idea of infinite space was philosophically unsettling. A structured dome felt safer and more harmonious. Stability in the heavens mirrored the desire for stability on Earth. People also believed that certain smells could ward off evil spirits, not just illness. Strong scents like garlic or incense were thought to repel unseen forces. Because smell is powerful and often associated with decay or danger, it was easy to link unpleasant odors with malevolent presence. If someone felt better after burning incense, the relief reinforced the belief in spiritual cleansing rather than considering psychological comfort. Another fascinating misconception involved the belief that sleep was a state where the soul partially left the body. Dreams were often interpreted as journeys or encounters with spiritual realms. While dreams do reflect mental activity, the assumption that consciousness physically traveled beyond the body-shaped interpretations of nightmares and prophetic visions. If someone dreamed of danger and misfortune later followed, the dream was seen as literal forewarning. Medieval maritime beliefs included the idea that sea monsters lurked at the edges of mapped waters. Whales, giant squids, or even floating debris were sometimes misinterpreted as colossal beasts. Since sailors faced genuine danger at sea, attributing storms or shipwrecks to monstrous creatures provided narrative explanation for tragedy. The unknown horizon invited imagination. Another common assumption was that illness could be transferred by symbolic substitution. In some folk practices, a disease might be moved from a person into an animal or object through ritual. If the animal later died, it was seen as proof that the illness had been carried away. The psychological comfort of believing the threat was relocated was powerful enough to sustain the practice. Medieval scholars also believed that certain historical relics were authentic without rigorous verification. Objects claimed to be fragments of sacred artifacts circulated widely. Since relics were deeply tied to faith and pilgrimage economies, questioning authenticity was rare. The belief rested more on spiritual authority than empirical proof. In agriculture, it was sometimes thought that talking kindly to crops or performing symbolic gestures would directly increase yield. While care and attention certainly matter, attributing plant growth to spoken words alone extended beyond observable cause. Good harvests following rituals reinforced the practice even if weather and soil quality were the real factors. The concept of inherited sin was also interpreted in ways that influenced medical and social views. Physical deformities or disabilities were sometimes seen as visible signs of moral failing in ancestors. This assumption linked spiritual judgment to biological variation, reinforcing stigma. It felt consistent within theological frameworks, but lacked biological basis. Another mistaken idea involved the belief that the human lifespan had dramatically shortened since ancient times because of moral decline. Medieval writers sometimes claimed that people in biblical eras lived hundreds of years due to greater purity. The contrast between scripture and contemporary life was interpreted as evidence of spiritual decay, rather than literary symbolism. Some believed that certain musical tones could summon or repel supernatural forces. While music undeniably affects mood, attributing direct control over spiritual beings to specific notes reflected the broader medieval conviction that the universe was constructed on harmonic principles. The harmony of spheres concept suggested that cosmic music governed planetary motion. If the heavens sang, perhaps earthly melodies resonated with them. Even basic physical phenomena were misunderstood. It was commonly believed that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones because they had a stronger natural desire to reach the earth. This intuitive idea, rooted in classical physics, seemed obvious when observing stones and feathers. Only later experiments would demonstrate that gravity accelerates objects equally in the absence of air resistance. The medieval worldview was cohesive and deeply symbolic. Each false belief was woven into a larger narrative about order, morality, and cosmic balance. Ideas reinforced one another, creating a self-consistent system that rarely required contradiction. The absence of experimental repetition, peer review, and technological tools made it extraordinarily difficult to challenge entrenched explanations. What stands out most is not that these beliefs were wrong, but that they were rational within their intellectual environment. Humans interpreted the world using the best frameworks available to them. The medieval era reminds us that truth evolves as methods improve. What feels obvious in one century may be overturned in the next. And perhaps that realization is the most enduring lesson of all. Certainty is often temporary, but curiosity drives progress forward. The medieval world was also filled with deeply held assumptions about how invisible forces structured everyday life. One enduring belief was that emotions themselves were physical substances moving through the body. Anger, for instance, was thought to literally heat the blood, while sadness cooled and thickened it. Although strong emotion does create physical sensations, the medieval explanation treated those sensations as the primary cause rather than a response. If someone fainted from shock, it confirmed the idea that emotion could dramatically alter bodily fluids. Without understanding hormones or the nervous system, these interpretations felt perfectly aligned with lived experience. Another widespread belief concerned the idea that certain animals could change their species over time. It was thought that worms could transform into flies, or that certain insects were intermediate forms of larger creatures. Observing metamorphosis without understanding developmental biology made such ideas compelling. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly looked like one creature turning into another.